Hello and welcome to Angular Air. Today we are talking about migration from Angular 1 to Angular 2. So there's a lot to discuss. First of all, I want to thank our sponsors though. Our prime sponsor, Auth0. And one quick thing, anecdote about them that I've experienced that I'm sure everybody has tried to implement social auth, and it can be a real pain. But if you're trying to implement it across platforms on both web and mobile, it's even more of a pain and have it work correctly. With Auth0 and both the backend and the front end widgets that they have kind of just right out of the box, it's something you can do within like an hour instead of a week. So they're awesome with everything related to security. Definitely check them out at auth0.com. ThoughtRam is doing more and more master classes, more and more training. They've definitely been really busy lately. They're going to be doing training at Angular Connect. They did it before ngConf. So you can check them out for training and learning Angular 2 at thoughtram.com. And then also, Patrick isn't here today, but he runs Angular class. So he does a lot of training as well in the US. And you can check them out at angularclass.com. So for our special guest to get today, we have on the one and only Tero.
Hello.
Tero, I know pretty much everybody who's listening knows who you are, but why don't you give an introduction to yourself?
Sure. So my name is Tero Parviainen. I'm a JavaScript developer based in Helsinki, Finland, doing lots of independent contracting and writing books and articles and all kinds of playing around with JavaScript and software in general.
And also, as a guest panelist today, we have Martin. Martin, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, guys. So I'm Martin. I'm software engineer from Prague, Czech Republic, and I'm running ngParty meetup, and I'm also the author of ngMetadata. Can you hear me, guys?
Yep.
Yeah. You sound good, definitely.
Okay, cool.
So Tero, for those of you that, he gave a quick summary, but I'll kind of add to what he said. Tero basically does everything. He is a master of all frameworks. He does just crazy talks where in projects. The first time I met or heard about you, really, Tero, was when you did the one of basically building your own Angular 1.
Yeah.
And that was just an amazing talk, an amazing project. And I think you've done a number of ones since then. Actually, most recently at ngConf. Do you want to talk a little bit about the talk that you gave at ngConf?
Sure. So that talk was called Generative Art in Angular 2, which no one understood before I gave that talk, which was interesting. But it was basically about using Angular for doing things that are not necessarily useful, but that are just fun to do because it's fun to play with technologies, and you tend to learn them as you play with them. So I was doing this sort of thing with ngAnimate and web audio, doing all kinds of visualizations and sounds and things like that. So I was just basically playing around with Angular and then did a talk about that. And it was pretty fun. I had people basically using a little web app I was using with their mobile phones, making sounds, and then I had some algorithms generating actually some ambient music based on RxJS observables and some random numbers in that room. So it was an interesting talk in general.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. Actually, so many different aspects, but the one thing I thought was just funny was that on top of everything else that you did, you used a new version of ngAnimate that pretty much no one outside of Matthias, really, in the world had been using.
Yes.
So that was pretty impressive.
That was pretty difficult to figure out how it worked, because there was no documentation, of course, because it's still not merged yet at this point. So it's very, very kind of
Well, you had the best type of documentation, basically just the code itself. You had to look through that to figure out what was going on, right?
Yeah, what's fun about the new ngAnimate is you can basically just look at what someone has defined as animations, and it kind of makes sense when you read it. So it's a pretty good API.
Cool. So, yeah, I mean, that has nothing to do at all with today's topic, but I just thought that was interesting and something more recent. So
Yeah.
let's get on topic here today and talk about migration strategies. And to start off, maybe Tero, can you give us kind of a high-level overview of what are the high-level approaches that people can take to migration from Angular 1 to Angular 2?
Okay, so I guess the most high-level question you can ask yourself is whether it makes sense for you to do something like that or not. That's kind of the first question you have to ask, because as everyone knows and everyone has been talking about for the past couple of years, these are two very different frameworks. Even though they have the same name, there's really nothing on an API level that's common between them, and even architecturally they are quite different. So you kind of have to make that assessment of whether that makes sense for you, and that you can begin answering, I think, by looking at what kind of Angular 1 application you have, because those can come in various shapes and forms, as we all know who have used Angular 1. Because we used to do things very differently in general with Angular like 2-3 years ago than what we do now with the new component stuff and all kinds of things that we have there. So the difficulty of migrating an application depends a whole lot on what kind of application it is. It's kind of pretty easy if you have an application that's all component based and all kind of architected with the best practices of today with the new component APIs and isolate scopes and all kinds of things. But then when you start deviating from that architecture, it gets difficult pretty quickly when you do things like have all kinds of nested inherited scopes and controllers and templates, or if you do a lot of DOM manipulation in weird places, or if you use a lot of open source Angular 1 libraries that don't necessarily have...
No one really does that, right?
No, of course not. Or at least we don't talk about it, because we shouldn't be doing that. But then there is all kinds of third-party open source libraries you use for things like forms and all kinds of things that might not have the exact counterparts in Angular 2. And then there are all these weird things that we use from Angular 1, like parsing or compiling things at runtime, or all kinds of things that you tend to do when you work on an application for a long enough time. You kind of get into these dark corners of the framework, and those are the kinds of parts that will be difficult. But
yeah, I mean, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh wait. Are you guys hearing an echo?
I'm not.
Can you mute your line for a second?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, I guess that's it. We'll just remember to mute each other's lines as we're going here. So you bring up a bunch of interesting points, and I think the first one that I definitely see with my own apps and a lot of the, actually more so even other people out there, is that if your Angular 1 app is sort of built in the sort of Angular 2 mindset of components and everything like that, it actually, you have a lot more options. It's a lot easier, and we'll get into some of those. But for some people, it can be really painful. I think the most, I talked to a lot of people at ngConf, and the most pain I heard were from the people who, they built for so long without having, strong standards. John Papa's style guide for Angular 1 wasn't always around, and even when it was, people weren't necessarily following it, right? So they have like this like crazy mess. So before we talk about like the ideal use case of alignment, like you have somewhat an alignment between Angular 1 and Angular 2, where do you start if you are just like one of these people on the totally other side of the fence, that you built things in a completely different way that doesn't align at all with Angular 2 kind of style, componentized style and everything like that? Just one big controller, let's say, with everything in it. where do you even start then? Is it just basically for those people it's throw it away and start again, or what do you think there, Tero?
I wouldn't say you need to throw it away because that's pretty much exactly the situation I've been in. I did a big application, started 3 years ago, which I did all wrong at first. There was a lot of huge controllers and huge nested structures of controllers and templates there and all kinds of things. And I've basically spent the last year slowly kind of migrating or refactoring it towards a component architecture. And I haven't even begun upgrading it yet, but I've been just cleaning it up. And even if we didn't ever upgrade that application, it's now much better than it was a year ago. So it's just a good idea to try to find these places in your application where you can kind of chop off to components and then put isolate scope around them and organize the files according to the style guide. And that's work you can do. It's not easy always because you're basically doing refactoring code that can be messy. But it's the same kind of work that people have been doing with their messy software for decades. And there's a lot of literature that can help you there, like the books about refactoring and working with legacy code. They apply surprisingly well in these cases. So it's just a matter of doing a whole lot of work that will pay off whether you want to actually upgrade or not.
Yeah, I completely agree with the kind of componentized model of Angular 2 and kind of implementing that. There's just benefits there regardless, like you're saying. Actually, a question to you, Martin, to kind of bring you into this conversation, because when you are thinking about just purely in terms of your Angular 1 app and just improving your Angular 1 app to make things easier, not necessarily talking about integration with Angular 2 yet. I know that you've been working on a library for ngMetadata that does part of that. There's also another library, ngForward, that you can also write Angular 2 style in Angular 1. Can you give us a background to like your library and how it's similar or different than ngForward and other similar things out there?
Yeah, sure. So basically, when I found ngForward, I wanted to use it in our enterprise huge project, but it was just unfeasible because it didn't cover a lot of things from Angular 1. So I just told myself, like, maybe I can write my own library from the scratch and purely for TypeScript. So I just took Angular 2 source code and used their decorators for all that stuff. So that's also one of the great things that you can say, because I'm using the same code base as Angular 2, and it's run with Angular 1, so it's really not so similar, but it isn't in architectural designs.
When you say you're using the same code base as Angular 2, what do you mean by that?
I just copy-pasted all the decorator stuff, how they are creating dependency injection, and everything works seamlessly with Angular 1. So basically, I backported everything. Recently, I also backported change detector reference, so you can do crazy stuff in Angular 1, like manually triggering the digest cycles behind the scenes and kind of optimizations in your code base. So that's pretty cool stuff. But as Tero said, also our code base was in very bad shape. So we slowly started to refactor everything. And my opinion on this is basically you have to separate your applications into those smart and dumb components. And ngMetadata can help you with that, because it literally forces you to write component-driven architecture. And by doing that, your team is learning basically Angular 2 syntax. And then when the right time comes for us, because we just cannot migrate or run hybrid Angular 2 Angular 1 application right away, because our manager and other enterprise things. So yeah, I mean, when the point will come in time, and our whole app will be in ngMetadata and TypeScript, it will be like no-brainer. I'm planning to add improved support for ngUpgrade, so it will be really just replacing the references for imports from ngMetadata/core to Angular/core, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's cool. I definitely like the idea of starting to build your Angular 1 app in kind of Angular 2 style, making your life easier. And the thing is that when you do that, you can do it in a much smaller, more granular fashion, like just kind of one class at a time and that type of thing. What about Tero? What are your thoughts on? I've heard a couple people suggest using TypeScript in your Angular 1 app to help with the transition as well. Other people I've heard say not to do that because they've tried it and it's like a nightmare, especially when you have a large existing app and you try to convert it to add types and you're wrestling with types and that type of thing. What are your thoughts on this, using TypeScript in Angular 1?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. That's how I started to do it early on, and I wasn't really happy with what was happening because that was the first time I actually tried TypeScript, and it turned out that isn't really the best way to learn TypeScript, which is to use it with Angular 1, which isn't really designed to be used with TypeScript. You have typings, but they're third-party typings, and then it kind of shows that they are not kind of core of the framework. But for one thing where it might help, particularly, is if you are using something that doesn't yet have any kind of module system. So if you're not yet in ES6 or basically Babel, where you can do imports and exports, you'll want to use that or TypeScript to get the modules, because Angular 2 is just way more pleasant to use with the module system than from the UMD bundles, or the APIs are just much nicer. But what I didn't have when I started was Martin's library, which basically builds on top of TypeScript and adds APIs on Angular 1 that are actually kind of designed to work well with TypeScript or just be TypeScript friendly, which is not what Angular 1 provides out of the box. So that's what I didn't have and what people now have as an option. So that I think right now it's much easier to do the TypeScript first thing than it was 6 months ago when I was getting started with this.
And Martin, do you guys use TypeScript?
Yeah, the ng metadata works primarily with TypeScript, and you can also use ES6, but I don't think it's worth to stay just on ES6 if you are planning to go to ES6, and if you have large code base. I think it's definitely worth it to use optional types, because in my experience, JavaScript is cool, but eventually you need those types. So
if you did that, then did you just quiet the turn off the warnings initially? Because I mean, there's no way you just turn TypeScript on. I mean, even though technically you could turn it on with the existing code base, right? Like it's going to spit out a million errors.
Yeah.
So did you turn it off initially, or did you actually just spend a ton, or like days or weeks, like adding all the right typings? What did you do?
So we are using Webpack as a bundler, and when we started the migration, there wasn't the option for allow.js in TypeScript. So we just did empty imports of the old JavaScript files, and file by file we transferred every file and module directive component to separate modules, and then added ng metadata. So yeah, I mean the transition isn't too hard, because everyone can say that it's pretty hard to move to TypeScript because you have to rename all the files. There are all those errors, but that isn't entirely true. But yeah, I guess it depends.
What about you, Tero? Do you have any tips for moving to TypeScript with Angular 1 from an existing code base?
Well, mostly just that, I would try to find even like a small project where I actually try TypeScript first with something easier than actually getting started with TypeScript at the same time as you do this migration, because it's hard to learn it at the same time as you're trying to work on this stuff. And you definitely don't put on or turn off the no implicit any, because you want to keep those implicit any annotations there, so you don't have to start by annotating your whole code base. Which is then, if you do that, then you'll be doing nothing else for the next week.
Right.
Which might be a useful exercise, but it's not what I would do.
Yeah, that would not be fun. Okay, let's get into the integrations side. So, like, once you talk about, eventually you do want to start building actually in Angular 2, and I've seen a number of different both approaches, different ways of integration. Tero, you want to give us kind of a high level there of what are the different ways, like when you have you want to start building something, some part of your app in Angular 2 and have it work with some part of your app in Angular 1. What are the different options there?
So I think the main tool to use there is this module called ngUpgrade, or just upgrade, which comes with Angular 2. That is basically this actually quite a small module that comes with it that allows running Angular 1 and Angular 2 side by side in the same application. So you begin this integration by pulling in Angular 2 and Angular Upgrade to your Angular 1 project, and then you switch your application bootstrap from the Angular 1 bootstrap to the Angular 2 Upgrade bootstrap. And then you have an application that still is purely Angular 1, but it's actually running through this hybrid upgrade adapter thing. And then you can start adding in Angular 2 things into it. So what the upgrade lets you do is it lets you have both Angular 2 and 1 components or directives running in that UI, as well as both Angular 1 and 2 services in your injector. And you can interoperate between these in both ways. So you can use an Angular 2 component from an Angular 1 directive or vice versa, or you can inject an Angular 1 service to an Angular 2 service or vice versa. So you can kind of do it in any way that makes most sense for your application. But the way that probably makes most sense to do it, if you have an option for doing that, is to start a new feature or something like that with Angular 2 instead of trying to kind of migrate your existing components to Angular 2. If you're basically trying to, or starting a new feature or something like that, then use Angular 2 for that. You can inject your existing Angular 1 services in there. You can even use your existing Angular 1 directives there. But doing new things is really the easiest way to do it. Now, sooner or later, you're going to want to start also migrating your existing directives and services to Angular 2. But for that, there's really no magic button you can press which will migrate them over. You will have to kind of rewrite them, or at least reorganize them to work with Angular 2. But what ngUpgrade lets you do there is to separate this work out over time. So you can do it one service today, the next one next week, and do like actual, productive work in between while having your application in a functional state at all times. So ngUpgrade, it lets you do this interoperation between these components, but it actually doesn't give you any shortcut through that actual migration work that you'll still have to do manually.
Sure, but if you're using ngUpgrade, wouldn't it create a rather large? I haven't tried to use it myself, but does it not create a very large package because you have basically all of Angular 1 and then all of Angular 2 and all of your both apps at the same time? Or is there a way of easily doing like lazy loading or something like that to kind of defer some of that?
Not really. So yeah, it does create a very large package, especially right now when Angular 2 by itself with all the dependencies is very large, when we don't yet really have that compiler stuff that Mishko was talking about at ngConf. So yeah, it'll be a big package in terms of the payload that you have to transfer, and I don't see any easy way around that at the moment.
Well, there's a couple of different things that I've heard as variations. So I have heard some people that so the ngUpgrade is focused at that UI layer when you're trying to integrate the two, right? But if you're just dealing with services like non-UI stuff, then you don't necessarily have to use ngUpgrade. There's other ways where basically either exposing your Angular 2 services to Angular 1 or vice versa. So have you kind of explored either of those paths?
I haven't really, no. So and I don't see how that would let you kind of not load Angular 2 and Angular 1 both on the page. You still have to do that if you are.
The way I've seen it done, or seen some people working on this, is like if you author a service in Angular 2 and then you just either through Webpack or your own custom transpiler, basically rewrap it in an Angular 1 service. So like through a build step, you would expose it. So it would be the same like code underneath, but exposed just like wrapped differently, basically.
Right, so you do this at build time, this kind of...
Yeah. So that only works with services, right?
yeah,
But
I guess that would work if that's something that kind of makes sense in your project. And in the end, Angular has always been quite good in this sense that your Angular factory or service doesn't really, you don't have to inherit from some magical super prototypes or anything like that. They're just regular functions and classes. They were in Angular 1 and they are in Angular 2, so that kind of makes it easier to interoperate because they are regular JavaScript things which you can just decorate with Angular stuff, and in that sense, it's not hard to use them outside of Angular even.
Yep. And the one other thing that I can think of, at least that I've heard talking to people at ngConf, was basically to split based off of routes. If you have an app that you're working on, and instead of trying to embed them, like if it wasn't that you were just trying to build a component, if you actually could segment off of routes, then potentially you would have different routes and different subdomains, and then that could easily load separate apps. So that in that case, you would be building a separate app, and you would kind of try to deal with it on that level. But that's sort of just like I don't know whether that's a hack or not, but that seems to be like a good solution if what you're doing kind of fits into that. I mean, everybody has a different use case, right?
Yeah, and that was actually, I think, the original migration plan that the Angular team came out with, what was it, 1 or 2 years ago. They said you split them by routes and you have different sub-applications for when you do an upgrade. But that wasn't enough for most people, which is why they came up with ngUpgrade after that. But I'm sure it'll be enough for many people, just not everyone.
Yep. Yeah, actually, one other interesting thing is that, so I ran a survey before ngConf talking about migration and what people's plans were and that type of thing. And so, really large number of people basically said that, with their Angular 1 apps, they essentially didn't even plan on, at least in the foreseeable future, upgrading it at all. Like that they were just basically putting it into maintenance mode. And any new business project or new thing they build in Angular 2, and this thing they would just kind of keep chugging along and hacking at it or whatever. So there's definitely a fair number of people that have decided on that particular strategy.
That's a perfectly, I think, viable choice to make, because though we have all these tools, it's not free, even anything approaching free or even easy. It is hard, and it only makes sense if you plan to have that application around for a long time, and you want to sort of take advantage of these new things that are on Angular 2, because Angular 1 will stay around for a long time, and perfectly viable platform to use, and people are still starting projects in it, so there's no rush to kind of escape that platform at the moment.
Yeah, completely agree. So what else have I missed? Are there any libraries or tools or resources out there that would be good to point out that people can kind of go to help as they're thinking about their migrating to Angular 2?
So basically my pick for this is the Tero's article about the refactoring to the smart and dumb components. I recommend everyone to read that because that's golden. That's superb content for really everyone.
Yeah, that's a good one. I agree. I love that article. And especially, I think that some people who pay attention in the React world, the concept is not totally unfamiliar, but there's a lot of people who just haven't thought of things in that way before, of trying to think of your components. Well, first of all, think of components in general, but then the segmentation between smart and dumb, that sort of simplifies things when you have a lot of dumb components. So yeah, I agree. Yeah. And actually, maybe Tero, maybe I'm glossing over that. Can you give us kind of just a quick overview of what smart and dumb components are, and basically the gist of your blog post?
Yeah, so the blog post was really the smart and dumb components thing was a small appendix on at the end of it. It was more about this whole process of refactoring your legacy Angular code base to components, which begins from the mechanical things you need to do, from getting rid of ng controllers and scope inheritance and this kind of sharing data through this scope hierarchy. And then it kind of ended up in that, okay, when you have these components, then you can start thinking about what the roles of these different components are. Because for the first time, you actually have an Angular application where you can think of data flow as something that actually makes sense, because it used to be just this soup of washers and scopes and bindings. And then you kind of can think of components in different ways. Some of them are components that just display data or get input from the user and don't really understand much about the context they are in, or where they should send the data when it kind of changes, or how they should talk to a server or anything like that. And those are the kinds of components that you could call dumb components, which I think was Dan Abramov's term for those, which are, you know, simple, they're easy to test, they always behave the same way when you give them the same data, and you can just plug them into different contexts very easily. And then you have these smart components, which then know much more about the business logic of the application. They know which services they should talk to when they want something to happen, and what dependencies they need, and how to kind of basically act as an orchestration layer on top of these dumb components. And it turns out that the best results I've seen is that when you make most of your application or UI code be these dumb components which don't really do anything much, and then just have a thin layer on top of that, or at the root where the smart stuff happens, where you actually integrate those components to your business logic. And that you can do easily with Angular 1 and of course with Angular 2, but you just have to walk this path to there from this current mess that you have, if you are like me and made that mess two years ago.
Yeah, it's kind of gets into a slightly different path of thinking, but you know, one thing when I started thinking more in the component mindset, the first iteration, I think I put probably too much logic and too much functionality in individual components, because you think in terms of like, oh, I'm just going to add I need to use this, I need to make this API call here, or like when this person clicks this button or whatever, and so okay, it's in the same area, and that's kind of cool. Like in a way, it's you know, still the same thing that you do with one huge ng controller, but just kind of segmented into smaller pieces. But that what you realize is after a while is that makes it harder to test those individual components, and really you end up duplicating a lot of stuff, like what I've noticed, like because you will have certain piece of logic in your components that, like, since you're making everything kind of able to do stuff like right at that level, you know, it's you just end up putting a lot more in there than you necessarily have to. Now, if you go the other way and you start kind of, you know, like you're saying, Tero, you know, make them very simple, thin, you know, more just like the visual layer on top of things, where they're easier to test. You kind of push that smarter logic, you know, up. And one interesting thing there, once you start doing it, is the whole stuff with NGRX and Redux. And I know that you are a big fan of that. And this goes a little bit beyond the migration stuff, but like because this is something that's kind of like in your wheelhouse, I'd be interested in kind of getting your thoughts on, you know, whether you usually do encourage people to go that far, like to start doing Redux or ngRX or something along those lines, or you know, it's good enough just to kind of have it at kind of a higher level component and leave it there.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I would especially encourage it. It seems to be like that's the kind of logical conclusion of doing all of this. You push that logic away from the components, and when you have nowhere else to go, you end up with this single place, which is in Redux your reducer function or family of functions that you have there, which makes a lot of sense. Now, whether that makes sense to actually go that far in most applications, I'm not sure. There is this one really practical benefit that you get from it, though, which we don't yet really have in Angular 2 or in Angular 1, which is the reason actually Redux came about in React, which is hot reload, basically. So where, if you listen to what Dan Abramov has said about the origins of Redux, he wanted to have hot reload for his applications, which is he can swap or change the UI code in the application and hot swap the UI while keeping the application state around. So they don't have to, or he doesn't have to click around to get the UI state back when they've changed the code, and it all happens instantly on the fly. Now, you can do that with Redux when your state is kind of pulled out from your components, so you can change the components and your state is held in the store, and then it flows to your new components right away. So it just works. Now, it does require some infrastructure as well. You have to have this tooling that is able to hot swap your components, and that's what I'm waiting for someone to do for Angular 2 right now. And I know Minko Getchev has done a prototype on this some time ago, and I think he's thinking about it right now as well. So from Redux, you get this hot reload thing, which is what I really want to use Redux for.
Yeah, Minko, you definitely have to make sure that this works. Actually, I thought I saw that he did do something in the past, but that might have been an early prototype. But yeah, no, I'll put the pressure on him, and we'll make this happen for sure. And one last question on this line of thinking actually is I never talked to you about this before, but like, what are your thoughts on ngRX? Again, this goes beyond the migration stuff, but I'm just more curious because literally, like, this is the type of stuff that I'm working on right now, right? I'm working on migration. I'm working on like how I'm architecting my app and like kind of building towards the future. And like you're saying, like when you start thinking in terms of smart and dumb components, you're moving it up, and then you like logically think like, oh, maybe let me try out this Redux thing. And one of the things I still have not fully decided on yet is, I kind of have started to go down the Redux route, but I still haven't fully bought in yet whether to do ngRX or Redux, the reactive way of doing things or not. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't have a good answer for that because I haven't really done anything serious with ngRX. I've tried it quickly. But yeah, I think the main difference seems to be that it's all based on the observable RxJS thing where Redux isn't. But then I saw some of the Redux bindings there are in Angular 2, and they also use observables, at least for some things. So the difference between the two doesn't seem to be as clear-cut as I thought in the Angular world. What I'll probably end up using is whoever supports hot reload first.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean the tooling on the React side is really good, so we definitely have to get that on the Angular side. We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yep. There's no reason why it couldn't happen.
Yep.
Agreed. Martin, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I like ngRX a lot. I'm more comfortable with the observables than with the classical Redux, but it's a matter of taste. But yeah, I mean, ngRX is trying to reinvent the wheel, but not really. It's just a different approach. And there are also some interesting discussions between Rob and Dan in some of those issues on GitHub. So I'll recommend everyone to check them out. Like what is the purpose of ngRX, why did it exist, etc., etc. So yeah, but in my opinion, it's really the right way to write your apps nowadays. Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna move to picks in just a second, but just to give a heads up. Next week, we're going to be talking with Wesley and Jesus again, talking about open source development. We had a great conversation with them a couple months ago, and we're going to continue that. We're going to have Chris from the UI Router project on as well, so we'll probably get an update on that. So that's going to be a huge action-packed show. And then the week after, we're having Jim Cummings on to talk about GraphQL, which is something I'm not as familiar with, and I'm really interested to learn more about. So for picks, Martin, why don't you start off?
All right, so I already mentioned that. I highly recommend to go through the Tero's blog about the smart app components, not just for the purposes of migration, but overall architecture. And for our Angular developers, I'll also recommend to check some videos on ngDiode for React, because if you're not really familiar with component-driven architecture and you take that course about React, you will get a really good overview over why it does matter and why it is important. So yeah.
Martin, your first time on the show and you're making React recommendations. This is grounds for a permanent banning.
No, I mean, I would like to thank React, because React opened our eyes how it should be done. So in this way, this is really amazing, because yeah.
No, I'm just joking. No, I hear you. No, it's a good recommendation. And Tero, why don't you give us your picks?
Yeah, so my first pick is the book Refactoring by Martin Fowler, which is a software engineering classic from the 90s, which has to do with, cleaning up your messes in code. The examples are all in Java, and it has nothing to do with the web or JavaScript, but it's really timeless, and it applies to this whole discussion of cleaning up your Angular code as well, because it's really the same things that we're still doing with Angular this time. And my second pick has to do with my talk at ngConf. There's a really good talk or conversation online by Brian Eno, who was kind of the main influence behind that talk, who was this musician and artist, where he talks about all kinds of things related to doing creative thinking and making art, and how to just go about your life as someone who likes to do creative work. So that's really an enjoyable hour to spend on something.
Cool, thanks, Tero. I just have one pick this week. Lucas Rebolke published a blog post based off of his ngConf training class on Electron, building an Electron app with Angular 2, which was a great workshop, and his blog post is really interesting. I'm definitely into Electron, and I've started to use some of the stuff that he's put out. So if you go to onehungrymind.com, and I'll have a link in the show notes, and check that out. It is pretty cool. All right, that's it for this week. Thank you very much, Tero. Thank you, Martin, and we will see you guys all next week. Hope everybody at Google I/O is having fun. See ya.
Thanks, guys. Cheers. Bye.